Yolanda Bergstrom-Lynch. I'm part of the planning committee for the conference. Firstly, thank you for attending. Welcome. Before I hand it off to the presenters, I just wanted to remind you we have a little assessment form. If you could fill that form out before you leave, particularly about this breakout session. And then we have a Goby box downstairs where you can just put your completed assessment. We use that feedback to improve future conferences, so it's very, very valuable to us. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to Andy and Lynn. All right, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andy Prince. I'm going to be speaking on fake news, debunking fake news, and how to use it in your instruction. My co-presenter, Lynn Gleason, right, she will present another aspect. So you're getting different flavors of fake news today, right? So at the end, your suitcase will be full packed with stuff you can take away and use. And I know you're taking notes. That's a good colleague. Okay. All right. So a little bit about myself and my library. I'm at New York City College of Technology, which is in downtown Brooklyn. It's part of the CUNY system. Lane is at BMCC, Bar of Manhattan Community College. We're at separate CUNY campuses. And I'll let her tell you more about herself when she's up next. The structure of my library is that we have one-shot instructions, right? That's the bulk of the instructional work. We also have 3 credit semester-long courses. And then we're divided up into instruction librarians and non-instruction librarians. So your electronic resource librarian, your acquisition system, and what have you, they're not teaching, right? That's on my side, okay? Which, this is why I'm interested in fake news, because it's a popular assignment. And so with that, let me tell you a little bit about, okay, that's not supposed to happen.
You'll probably hit the enter button.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So our campus is very diverse, right? Our students speak over 140 languages collectively. Yes. So it's a wonderful place to work, and I can't say anything bad about it. Right. So I thought I would start with this, right? Like, what is fake news? Okay. What do you guys think? What is fake news?
Anything you don't agree with?
That's the current news.
Yeah, that's been the trend. Yes, that has been the trend. Right. So normally when students come to me for instruction, right, this is a very popular assignment. I like to start with asking them, like, what do they think is fake news, right? And one of the things that a lot of my students will say, oh, there's no such thing as fake news. That's just a term on TV, right? Which is very distressing. We'll talk about that later. So we figure out, I still would love to use this, and okay, here we go. All right, so this is from a Pew Research, right? So we find that a lot of folks are confused about fake news. We also know that a lot of people get their information online. So it's very important for me when I teach this assignment, right, to go into students' information seeking habits. Okay? And also the impact of fake news, right? How does it impact them? How does it affect them, right? And I would like to stop here and share with you a video I like to play for my students. So I used to do the Dylan Thomas video.
So let's call him
But now I
Dimitri.
start doing
Just a guy making a living in the small town of Veles, Macedonia.
I wrote that the celebrity wants to kill Trump. The Queen of England wants to meet Trump.
I'm
Trump
so
and
sorry.
Putin had a
It's
secret
audio
meeting
and
in
not
Mexico.
video.
Dimitri is 18 years old, and he says that in the past 6 months,
But I
he's
think
made
you
more
can
than
still get the download from the
$60,000
audio.
writing, posting, and sharing fake news articles about the American election. His biggest cash cow?
Make America great again.
Donald Trump.
Trump isn't a politician just like any other. I think that nothing could beat Trump supporters when it comes to, social media engagement. And that's why we stick to Trump.
In the final 3 months of the presidential campaign, the most viral fake news stories outperformed the most viral real news stories on Facebook, according to a BuzzFeed analysis. Most were pro-Trump. And some 150 fake US politics sites have been traced here, to Dimitri's Macedonian hometown. He was willing to lift the veil on his bootstrap operation, which he claims garnered 40 million page views in the past 6 months. To draw readers, his fake stories copy the style of more mainstream organizations, including NBC News.
The Republicans love the veterans. They love the veterans. They respect them, I think, the most of anyone. And what you do is you say Obama donated $300 million to Hillary Clinton's campaign that he took from the veterans. And people will open that immediately, saying why.
For headlines, he builds on a format that might also be familiar to consumers of traditional news.
The most read news articles are usually the one containing the clickbait words. And the clickbait words are, as you know, the oh my god, breaking news, wow. If you say, oh my god, new bunch of emails from Hillary got released, people will like to open that because they want to see more.
Really, Dimitri says, the fake news game is pretty straightforward.
You see what people like, and you just give them. If they like water, you give water. If they like wine, you give wine. It's really simple what we do.
Fake news has affected Venice. In a country with almost a quarter of its citizens unemployed, and in a town with an average annual income below $5,000, the impulse to deceive was seemingly irresistible. So now, as the money flows, so too does the liquor. This club is cashing in on the success of fake news entrepreneurs, who get paid relatively majestic sums by Macedonian standards by selling advertising on their sites.
What happened in our town is that a lot of money came, and a lot of people quit their jobs, so they can put a lot of effort in this, as they saw this as the big ideas, their big chance, their big change in their life.
One venue here even plans to host a club night on the day Google pays out its ad revenue. In response to concerns that fake news may have influenced the election, Google and Facebook recently announced new measures to crack down on sites like Dimitri's. But his Google AdSense account is still up. Besides, Dimitri says, fake news didn't alter the election. And if anyone needs to take responsibility, it's surely not him.
I know who is the responsible one for the election, and that's the American people. I think the American people take their politics not as serious as other countries do. No offense to Americans, but we don't believe such hoax news.
And that really gets my students, right? And that's why I play that clip for them, because that really gets them understanding the back end of what's happening and in evaluating fake news. And just hearing, right, someone who's creating this news that they're accessing, hearing them talk about the process, right, that really allows me to open up a discussion, right, on expertise, on watchers' expertise, right? Okay, so I discovered that that did not work. No, it's not. It's not connected. That's why there's a trouble. Not even the keyboard. Keyboard's not going.
Try hitting it a little harder. I found that the keys were a little soft.
Try hitting it. When you said it was a little bit soft.
Yeah, I noticed a couple of times when I would tap a button, the button didn't work, and then when I did it a little bit stronger, it did work. The laptop.
It's not working. It's not working.
Or
try,
Just
did you
regular
try
slide.
this one? Because this one works really well. Oh. It's so hard because it was working for me. Try this. What is it, the line slide? Is it
Number 9. is
Okay, from current slide. Okay, now try it. I wonder if it's the presenter view that's messing up. Maybe you should try to take those and take turns. Yeah, try using it without the presenter view. Presenter view is that.
Right. So I guess my slides aren't working, and I will ask you to go to factitious.com. We're going to play a game. This is one of the games that I play with my students until we figure out how to get the slides working again. So it's factitious.com, right? And this is a game I play with students to get them thinking about sources. So is everyone there? Good. So you're going to either slide to the right or slide to the left, right? And
Is it factitious.somethingelse.com? Because I got a weird website.
I put game in there, factitious game. And that should be helpful. So you're swiping right if you think the article is real and left if you think it's fake. Now, one of the nice things as people are loading up their device, I like about Factitious, is the fact that students are able to see the source and make an evaluation, right? The name of the source, like if this is a source that they would trust, right? So it's a way to gamify learning, right? And they like it because they're all using their cell phones, right? And I was telling folks earlier that I just presented in Sweeney Law yesterday about cell phones and use in instruction. So the students are using it. So this is a great way to get them transitioning with a device that they like into thinking about fake news. So can I go ahead?
Yeah.
All right, let's go. Has anyone played Factitious before? No. Okay, we got 2 again, so let's go.
So what level we're gonna go through?
My phone doesn't like it.
Your phone doesn't like, okay.
Bless you.
Right. So here's our article, right? So I have them skim the article a bit, right? Sometimes one of the nice things about this is that you can see the source. I can scroll down and show them the source. Right. Did everyone vote? All right, let's reveal. Show source. Right. How do we all do on that? So my stuff is still acting a little bit wonky. I don't see. Now I need to move to my next question, and it's just not letting me. I'm sorry guys, I actually don't know what to do now because my next tab is not available. And I was hoping to play this.
Oh, was that the other thing that got closed?
No, it's open, but normally there's a next button where you can proceed to the next question.
Would it work to switch your browser maybe?
You think maybe go to Chrome?
That's where I started.
It's just slow.
Okay, she's slow. All right. Okay, here's our next question. And here's the source. Okay, so you get the flavor of this, right? So normally I will do this a few rounds, right, and get students engaged in thinking about sources and authority and where the source came from. Because one of the exercises I also like to do is that I will print out quotes, right, and then on the far left I'll have the source available, right, and give students a particular topic. So I try not to pick something very controversial, because if it's very controversial, then they have this polarizing response to it, and it distracts from them learning the research strategies I want them to leave with. So maybe something environmental, maybe like, because I'm in New York, so maybe I pick Sandy or something like that. And one of the useful things, one of the things I notice about doing that is that students are looking at the quote, right, to see if it will fit with the assignment, and they don't look at the source, right? So this is one of the reasons why I combine factitious, right? Because the articles, like, they do a great job of what I couldn't come up with, right? Is it real, is it not? Right? And this is one of the reasons why I like playing factitious. All right, so moving right along. Let's keep my fingers crossed that I can go back to my PowerPoint.
Did you save it to the,
No, I did not. I kept it on my
you can probably click that Mozilla folder. The yellow folder? Yeah. Next to the Internet Explorer icon.
It has a lot of yellow.
Oh, did you put it in?
And then that's your,
Let's see.
and then enable content.
We seem to be in business again.
Yay.
Yay!
There we go.
There we go.
All
Right?
right.
So this is something I took off of Fordham University, and I like to give it to them. And one of the reasons I like it is because it gets to the heart, right, of explaining about fake news. Right? It's not entirely comprehensive, but it's fairly good. And it's low text, right? Because I find like if I work hard on a lot of handouts and I give it to students and it's every text, they're not using it, they're not reading it, right? So this is one of the things I like about this particular one. Should I try my clicker again? Let's go for it. So definitely, if you're teaching fake news, you want to talk about, can it be verified, right? And we want to talk about credible journalists, right? How they're identifying that. What is their research process, right? How do they seek information? And that's one of the things that opens up the dialogue with students. Right? The other thing I like to bring out is about bots, right? How does an article become viral, right? How does it spread so quickly, right? So this one goes with a clip. There's a 60-minute clip, but I'm not going to play because I know what happened last time. But I promise you there's a 60-minute CBS clip on how something gets spread virally, right? And they love this particular clip. So I know you're taking notes because for your colleague. And this is the clip, but I don't want to risk doing it because I don't want to jump into my colleague's time. And that's the title. Again, this is from IFLA, an infographic. Again, very low text, right? So they're actually using this. One of the things that I like to do with this is that sometimes I put it on a QR code, right? So that they can go away with this information when they leave with their articles, right? Because oftentimes when you're doing one-shot instructions, professors come in with their class in an integrated class, and they come in and they expect us to do our librarian thing and students to leave with articles, right? And they leave with these articles, and this is in context of an undergrad school, and they don't know what to do with them, right? This is their first interaction with scholarly articles, and they're having a hard time with it, right? So anything that will make the information easy, I try to incorporate it in my teaching. And so this is something I alluded to earlier, right? Prior to this incident, I was using the Dylan Thomas clip, like how you get information and how misinformation is dangerous, and then I just started using this particular clip, right? I hope no one minds if I don't play it. Yeah. And I often support it with this confirmation bias, right? Where people believe what they believe and they seek out information to confirm what they believe. So this is very useful. The one great useful thing about it is that students try to connect, right? They start connecting to their process of information. That's another YouTube clip that I learned my lesson. I'm not going to mess with my YouTube clips, right? And again, we go through the 7 information zones, right? What's the purpose of that information? Right? Again, I use this to talk about Watcher's expertise in responsible journalism. Now, Melissa Zemdars, right, she does a great job, right, of identifying fake news websites. Right? And that link, right, will lead them to the various websites that are available. Should we try it, guys? I don't know. Let's see. Buffering. Right. So let me try to, maybe I'll go to my next slide. It seems like if I try to load something, that's when the...
That's probably idle.
That's why it's not going.
We have to close it.
I'll have to close it and open it again. I was afraid of that. All right, let's try it again. Here we go. All right, so we went through these, so I feel comfortable just skating through. So this is what I was alluding to earlier with the fake news websites, right? And that link will give you, this is just a snapshot of some of the websites that are available, right? And she does a great job of having that key to identify these website categories. Right. This is one of the charts that my students will leave with, how to identify fake news in 10 steps. Right. And we actually tie this to an activity, right, which is very useful. So, you know, we're all librarians, right? And I feel it's incumbent on us, right, to battle fake news, right, and help our students. right? At the end, I'm going to provide you with a resource list, which is very helpful. The News Literacy Projects, anyone familiar with that? Right? It's a really great website with helping with fake news and planning lesson plans. Now, some of the things there, right, so we played factitious, right? We got a little flavor of that. So I have the News Literacy Project on there. Some of them are subscription-based, like Checkology, that you do need to subscribe to. I don't subscribe to it because my institution will not pay for it. But I try to use the free ones to incorporate it into my lesson plan. And I would like to end with this, because I believe I'm cutting into your time now. Alright. So again, I'm Mandy Prince. You can contact me, and I'll be happy to share my slides with you. Okay, now you're up next.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for inviting us here to Connecticut. We're very grateful to be here. I'm Wayne Bliss, and I work at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. We have 27,000 students, or sometimes we have 26,000 students, depending on how many we get per year. I teach about 50 library instruction classes per semester. We have a very small teaching group, so we're pretty busy. I'm just going to try to escape out of it. Yeah.
I know you're loading yours.
Yeah, no, I'm good, I'm good. So, yeah. And so here comes my slides. This is a project that I did over the last, I would say, maybe 5 years. I was before, I mean, everybody's talking about this. I don't prefer to use the term. No, just let me do it, okay? I'm just talking while I do it, so they have something to listen to
Okay.
while I do it. Sort of multitasking, as it were. Okay, so if you could just take a look at this for a minute. I thought it was really interesting, and in the 90s, Michio Kakutani was already talking about the ideas of the breaking down of the old notions of truth. And instead there would be perceptions, opinions, things like that. Mm-hmm. So as we decided there were many truths, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? We had diversities of opinion, but this idea of there being actual factuality started to degrade. Kevin Young, the great writer, did a disinformation book that I would recommend called Bunk, and one of his things that he perceived was, what if truth is not an absolute or a relative, but a skill, a muscle that we can all develop? And that's sort of what I'm trying to do in my project with my students. I teach this frequently at the beginning of a library instruction class, if it's about an hour and a half. Or sometimes I'll teach multiple library instruction class to the same class of students, and one of them might be a 20-minute lesson on disinformation. So as I was trying to ask myself back in like 2015, I was trying to ask myself, I ran into students who believed conspiracy theories, students who didn't think there was anything real anymore, and so on. I thought, or we're just listening to a lot of propaganda. And so, I had, for instance, a student in a class tell me that the reason we got free subscriptions to the New York Times was so that the New York Times could manipulate us. And I would hear things like, where do you get your news? And people would be telling me, well, I get most of my news from YouTube or Facebook feeds. And we all know this is happening. I mean, I'm not telling you something that you don't see every day of your life. So I saw this in the newspaper, and I decided to use this as an example, just at the beginning of my class, just a single example, where Fox News had a commentator, Stephen Emerson, had actually asserted that you can't go into Birmingham, England, and you remember that, right, without Muslim attire. Now, at the time, the census in England stated that Birmingham only had 22% Muslim population. So clearly somebody without Muslim attire was going into that. And so after that happened, a lot of people in Britain on Twitter started mocking these assertions, you know, under hashtag false news facts. And so there were some really funny tweets, and I used these in my classroom because it would start students laughing. Basically, it's a lot easier to start talking about things if you're kind of laughing and you're on the same page and you're comfortable. So I would use humor at the beginning of the class to start talking about more serious topics. So here's another one, you know, if you're a non-Muslim and would like to visit Birmingham, all right with you. Camilla Sham, she spoke out about it. Now, around that same time, there wasn't the election yet, but one thing I noticed is that people were starting to say things to me, like in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. They would say, oh, okay, you know, I was interested in voting for Hillary, but she's really ill, so I guess I won't be. And so I used this as a sort of a teaching lesson with students at one point. And it wasn't about, I want to make this perfectly clear, it wasn't about whether you want to vote for Hillary or Donald Trump or anybody else. It wasn't about whether you're a Republican, it wasn't about whether you're a Democrat, it was really about disinformation. So this was important because in a very large community college like we have here, we have people of every political type. We have people who are socially conservative. We have people who are really progressive. We have everything under the sun. So I wanted students to understand that when they go onto YouTube to get their news, they might encounter something like this by Paul Joseph Watson of InfoWars, where he said that she had severe brain damage. And then we also talked about what happens here. You know, when you pull up one video, agreeing videos come next to it, so that you assume, if it's repeated so many times, does that make it true? And that's what I ask the students about. I say, well, what do you think if something's repeated and you see it all over the internet? It's definitely true. Because this was the problem with my neighbor in Brooklyn, is she saw the video over and over in different places and different types of videos about Hillary Clinton's supposed illness. Now you can debunk that, and then I teach students, there are places you can go, like, you know, academic studies, or you can go to Snopes or factcheck.org, and they will actually look into it, and in the article they will show why it isn't true, for instance. Or you could go on a medical site like the Parkinson's Foundation, and they also and also Lisa Lehrer, who was in some of these viral videos about Hillary Clinton. She was an Associated Press reporter, and she was actually pictured next to Hillary Clinton while Hillary Clinton did this kind of head wobbling thing, and which was actually a GIF, or a GIF if you prefer to announce it like that. So they take Hillary Clinton's kind of shoulder shimmy shake, and then they turn it into a GIF, and it looked like, if you'd never seen a person have a seizure before, you might possibly think it was a seizure. And what I love about this one in particular was the doctor, Dr. Oken said that they show a lack of awareness about Parkinson's itself. That first of all, she doesn't present with Parkinson's, but secondly, how is it that maybe a person who has Parkinson's could be an excellent politician and leader? So they also speak out for people with disabilities, which I really liked. If you don't want to go political, I want to point out that there are other things you can work with, such as hoaxes, like the chemtrails hoax. When I was at a conference in Pittsburgh, I met a man who believed that we were being poisoned by the government, who had airplanes, and the condensation trails in the airplanes would spray down poison on us, and this was some kind of a plot by our government to make people sick. So you can teach condensation trails. You can show students how, in fact, there are scientific studies that dispute this, and how you can fact check that. So I'm really interested in working with the critical thinking skills of the students, or you might want to use Pizzagate. This is one of my close friends lives in Washington, D.C., goes to this pizza all the time. Supposedly a child sex ring was in the basement of this pizza, run by Hillary Clinton and John Podesta. And in fact, this pizza doesn't even have a basement. So, you know, so students love to talk about that kind of stuff, and you can show, for instance, you know, the effects of such hoaxes, that in fact, somebody came into that pizza parlor with a rifle and started shooting. And then, well, he's now serving 4 years in prison. And then later, recently in January, they tried to burn the pizza down. And this is just some poor man who runs a business. And then, of course, students do understand that disinformation is not just some sort of funny thing, it's something that can lead to a great deal of social suffering, as was the case recently in New Zealand. So the students, when I do this type of thing, I will usually not talk like I'm talking to you while I'm presenting, but I will ask students, what do you think about this? And I get a discussion going. So in the classroom, it would be a slightly different structure. I don't have time here to do that type of thing, but I would ask students to talk about what they think about this. Now, after I did single stories, I decided that a good thing to do would be to set up a slideshow. So after the election, like I guess it was probably around 2016 or 2017, I started creating a lesson plan. So I decided to use the Black Lives Matter movement as my example, because our students, first of all, the idea about, you know, the police and the black community, many of our students, they might already realize this is a complex problem. For example, some of our students might have families who are police officers, but they might also know people who are racially profiled. So it was a good one because it was a topic that my students could understand. And you could get a lot of people talking about it. They wanted to talk about it. So the first thing I would do is I would ask, what do you think when you see a headline like this? You know, I would ask students, when you see this statement, the numbers are in, Black Lives Matter is wrong about police. And students actually have really interesting things to say. So for instance, a student might say, well, what numbers are they talking about? Like, where did they get their numbers? What do they mean by wrong? And when you see an article, a news article, in this case from a magazine, the National Review, and you see, and it says wrong, is that news or is that opinion? So we could talk about the difference between factual information and opinion, and then we would look in the text of the article itself. So for instance, when it says here, this conservative response is clear, while no one believes police are perfect, they tend to use force appropriately, then the second sentence is very telling. Moreover, racial disparities in the use of force are largely explained by racial disparities in criminality. And when I show them that, my students start rolling their eyes. They get really, really fed up, because that's like saying that particular populations of people are more tending to be criminal than others. So I say, well, what do you think about that? And then the students can talk about this idea of bias. You know, how you can have an article that's literally biased against a population of people, right? And then down here, they accuse, sorry, I'm losing my voice here. They accuse the Washington Post of spinning these things. So then we go next to the text of the Washington Post study, because that's where the numbers came from. And we discovered that, in fact, they're not making a spin argument. What they do is it's a huge study that they did both in 2015 and 16, where they took every police shooting that was done at that time, that year, and they said, well, was the person who was shot armed? Were they not armed? What were the circumstances? And they reported on that. So in fact, it's not really a spin article, it's an actual article with statistics. And you can read it, it goes on for many, many pages. And what they really actually say is that although black men make up 6% of the US population, they account for 40% of the unarmed men shot to death by police this year. And then we can talk about what that means. And I encourage the students to go and look at the study. Because if you actually look at the study itself, you find that they are as sympathetic to the police as they are to African American communities. And they say many, many admirable things about the police as well. So this way we can see how that one's been framed. Now, then the next slide that I show them, which we talk about, is turning away from street protests, Black Lives Matter tries a new tactic in the age of Trump. So what I'm asking the students in this particular case is I'm asking them, how is this different than the first article by the National Review? That is to say, are they saying, first of all, are they saying that the Black Lives Matter movement is right or wrong?
No.
What are they doing? Can you see it all right? Should I make the text a little bigger? I can try to make that a little bigger because it's a little grainy. I don't know, I'll try to scroll down a little bit. Oops, that didn't work. Okay. Well, anyway, it says, okay, here, for instance, but activists say the movement's efforts have entered a new phase, one more focused on policy than protest, prompted by the election of President Trump. So in other words, they're saying, well, they're not going to protest anymore, they're going to try new ways of, and then they quote Alicia Garza, one of the leaders of the organization. So the things I try to ask students about when we have our discussion is, why is this different? What is this telling you about the Black Lives Matter movement? And generally speaking, students start to understand that they're talking about the strategies of the movement or the nuances of the movement, as opposed to, are they right, are they wrong, which is sort of a blanket statement. And then, of course, I show them an opinion piece by a lawyer, Nicole D. Nelson, and we talk about the difference between, in a paper of record, like the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Guardian, you have two sides. You have the news side and you have the opinion side, and they have separate editorial boards. They are not the same, and they have separate writers, separate editors, and how in a credible news source they will show something as news being news, but opinion is actually stated as opinion. And then the last one in my slide set for the students on Black Lives Matter is about, it's sort of a sadder version of how the Black Lives Matter can be portrayed. And in this version, it's an actual social media campaign that's a fake organization. So Blacktivist was something created by the Russians to actually get people to go out onto the streets in demonstrations. And they not only were very successful, but even some people who were involved in the community of organizing started going to demonstrations that were actually created by the Russian events. So students can see that, you know, when you're talking about disinformation, and I prefer to say disinformation, not fake news, because I believe that the term fake news has actually been besmirched at this point. It means nothing. But that you can create information that's actually not even an organization that doesn't even exist. So then we all know now, I mean, this is old news already, but we all know now that the fake Americans were created on Facebook. This is a guy, Melvin Reddick, who actually he says he goes to Central High School and Indiana University of Pennsylvania, which are real schools, but they have no record of him ever attending because he isn't real. And they stole this poor Brazilian family's pictures from some other Facebook page and used it to put it onto this fake Melvin Reddick page. So these are a real family in Brazil. Apparently the outlets, the plugs are Brazilian, but this person doesn't exist at all. Now, I mean, I'm not really showing this anymore because at this point because everybody knows about this, but it was important because our students do use a lot of Facebook news feeds for their news, and they still do. So at that point, one thing I usually want to show students is this, that just because we say the Russians, first of all, this type of work, this type of fake news work is no longer just being done by the Russians. It's being used all over the world by anybody. And also, there are real Russian journalists, and it's important if I talk about Russia to also assert that there are important people doing important reporting in Russia who are real journalists. You know, I think this is important because we tend to have this us against them attitude between Russia and the United States. So we talk about Ludmila Savchuk, who actually went undercover in a troll farm and then reported about it, which is a fairly dangerous thing to do. And then I also show them, these are all Russian journalists, many of who worked for Novaya Gazeta, and were reporting on Chechnya and corruption in Russia, and they were all assassinated for their reporting. And Stanislav Markelov, who was their human rights lawyer, assassinated also. So I want students to understand that the news, like everywhere you go around the country today, people say, oh, the media, you know, oh, this is all the media's fault, you know? And that's a sort of a blanket statement in my view, because the media is actually so many things, and they're not all the same. You can't make blanket statements about the media. And in fact, people all over, our students who are international students, when I start talking about this, they start like nodding their heads because they know that in some countries it's actually physically dangerous to report what your government is doing. So I want students to try to understand that journalism is not always a noble profession, but it can be a profession where people get information that they really need to make the decisions they need to make. Of course, at that point, when I was doing this project, news started coming out about Russia Today, RT, and Sputnik, and buying ads. Twitter decided to ban them from buying ads. And of course, Facebook and YouTube have their hands full at this point trying to get hate speech off the sites. But you know, it's everywhere. It's really difficult. At that time, I went down the elevator of my building, and I actually was going out. I always exit through this particular entrance in the building where I work. And I walked out the door, and lo and behold, right in front of me was a giant, like the subway, the bus shelter. There was a bus shelter ad for Russia Today, which is basically run by the Kremlin. And you know, and in my classes, I often had students, if I said, well, what does your family like? How do they like to get their news? Frequently, students would say, well, I like to listen to RT. I like to watch RT. And they weren't in any way aware that it was sponsored by the Kremlin. You know, they saw it as being the same exactly as, you know, CBS News, PBS, you know, CNN, and not realizing that it was an entity of a government agency. So that really kind of annoyed me. And so I have to say, some of us at the college decided to make a complaint to the MTA because we feel like it's hard enough for our students to be able to know what is credible or not credible, and having the MTA actually sponsored, and the hilarious part is my daughter actually works for CBS News. And at that same time, when she would go out of her building, right there by CBS News would be the RT, the same ad. So they were all over the city. So I felt that if it is a political entity, if it is not really a news site, it's run by a government, that maybe our MTA shouldn't be sponsoring an ad like that. So I wrote them a brief letter, and I got an answer back, and they sent me a link to what their advertising policy prohibits. So I clicked the link, and of course, it was a dead site. So then I did a search, because I'm a librarian, I did a search, and I found it on the site, and it turns out that political things were not allowed. So I thought, oh, well, do I really want to write them another letter? I mean, I'm kind of busy, I work really long hours. So I get this email back like 2 weeks after I sent my letter, and you can see it says, we have forwarded your feedback to appropriate supervision for review. Well, I go downstairs the day I got my letter, and the ad was gone. So basically, I'd like to close by saying it's up to us to, we can't say, very often I hear people say, there's nothing we can do. What can we do? It's such a big, deep problem, you know? But I think there's a lot of things that we can do. And one of the ways we can help is to make students understand that it doesn't matter what they are watching or looking at so much as how they interrogate what they read. And what I'm really interested in encouraging everyone to do is to develop, have conversations with your classrooms, help your students develop, and I'm not saying it should be progressive. I want to make perfectly clear as I end. It's not really about whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're an independent. It's really about reading deeply. And reading, if you hear a news story, you read it in more than one place. And it's up to you to decide what is true or not true. It's not, everything has become so polarized. But we should be able also to listen to people who disagree with us and learn from them. So I like to develop those kind of faculties in my students. Thank you.
Thank you.